This podcast is made possible by your support and your donations. Thank you. And by the purchase of my book called Everyday Buddhism, Real Life Buddhist Teachings and Practices for Real Change. I will post an affiliate link to the book on Amazon in the show notes. And if you've already read it, please take a minute to rate and review. And also consider purchasing it again for a friend or family member as a gift. Welcome to Everyday Buddhism, making every day better by applying the proven tools found in Buddhist concepts. Welcome to episode 110 of Everyday Buddhism, Making Every Day Better. In this episode, I talk with Nadia Colburn. Nadia is the author of the poetry books I Say the Sky and The High Shelf. And her poetry and prose have appeared in more than 80 publications, including The New Yorker, American Poetry Review, the Kenyon Review, Spirituality and Health, Lion's Roar, and the Yale Review. She holds a Ph.D. in English from Columbia University, is a yoga teacher and serious student of Thich Nhat Hanh, and is the founder of Align Your Story Writing School, which brings traditional literary and creative writing studies together with mindfulness, embodied practices, and social and environmental engagement. The school has a community of over 30,000 mindful writers. Nadia lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with her husband and 2 children. So stay tuned as we talk about many other things, including we listen to Nadia read some poems from her latest book, I Say the Sky. We will be talking about the relationship between Buddhist meditation practice and writing, poetry and literature as a companion or an offering as a mirror to yourself, literature as a place where people can speak truths that are sometimes uncomfortable but not talked about all the time, and writing as therapy and healing. Sit back and enjoy the flow of conversation and poetry with the delightful Nadia Colburn. This conversation starts now. Hello, Nadia. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm so glad to be here.
So first, let me thank you for the book. The book is I Say the Sky, and thank you for your gift of you to me in I Say the Sky, because you're letting yourself be seen in your confusion, your anxiety, trauma. I'm not saying all this to turn readers off, because there's there's other stuff there too, but to let yourself open like that is it's brave, I think, and yet poets do it all the time. But and also your ability to all poets do this, but this happened to me a lot in reading yours, is to ability to sort of stop the world and feel and see your words and glimpse where you are and what you feel at that time.
Thank you so much. This is really what I hope to do in my poem. So I'm glad that happens for you as a reader.
Yeah, it does.
It's lovely to hear.
It does. Multiple poems I would be reading along and enjoying the feelings and the descriptions and the seeing, but at the same time, some of them were just like I would have to stop dead, and just take it in for whatever it hit me with. I think that's the elusive quality of poetry. We don't always know what happened there. So
thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So I have to say, I have been a journal writer on and off to a greater and lesser extent throughout my life, ever since I had my little diary with the lock, and I've always loved reading and writing poetry. I do write poetry, although I pretty much a hack poet. But the act of writing is a wonderful practice, I think, in being present in life as it is, which is a very Buddhist concept.
Yeah.
It's also in the sense of non-conceptual awareness, right? And in the deep exploration of self. So for me, journaling or free writing, which I sometimes free write to, sometimes my purpose is to free write for something, but it never becomes something. So it's just
Hmm.
free writing. So it could be free writing for a talk, for my sangha or a podcast or a poem or a book. But if I allow it to be truly free writing, it interrupts my conceptual focus on the writing, right? And I think of it as like journaling or free writing as my inside sort of breaking out into words I didn't even think, right? They just
Mm.
came out of me. So, in those ways, for me, writing is as deep of a spiritual practice as any other practice I have engaged in. Any kind, I mean, and I've been a Buddhist practitioner and Buddhist minister for decades. So, and so I think it's undervalued as a spiritual practice because maybe the perception is that you kind of like have to do it the right way, have to know what you're doing, whatever that is, or and in poetry, I think it can be seen as, scare quotes, literary, and out of touch with the everyday. And as you
Mm.
know, this is everyday Buddhism. We're all about the everyday. So, as a writer, as a poet, and as a writing teacher, how have you experienced this?
Well, I think you say so many things so beautifully. So I want to just reinforce what you've already said. Um, it's interesting that you've had the idea that people think of writing as kind of outside of the everyday, because I think of it as so much a part of, not that you need to have a daily practice, but it's a way to be aware of and um, appreciate the everyday that's around us. And where else do we live other than the everyday?
Right.
Um, so so I think it helps us come into the present more. And I have to admit that there have been times in my own writing practice, because I also have a meditation and Buddhist practice, where I felt, is there a tension between these two practices? Because my meditation teachers are telling me to drop the ideas, drop the thoughts, just be present. And then when I write, that I'm present, but then also the past comes in. I want to write about the past or my ideas about the future. Is that taking me from the present? And then I think over time I realize, well, each practice supports the other,
Yeah.
the meditation practice and the writing practice. And when we practice, yes, we don't want to attach to those thoughts that come up, but when we're really present with ourselves, we have the past within us,
Yeah.
and then we become aware of that, and the writing can be a place to explore that and the seeds of the future. So for me, I feel like I'm able to be more present because I have both the meditation and the writing practices that can do slightly different things, but that are very complementary.
Yeah, and that was sort of, you already led into my next question, which was, as a Buddhist practitioner, I was going to say, what do you think the study and practice of Buddhism brings to your poetry? And I think you just kind of answered that. And one of the ways I might talk to what you just said is that, yeah, I know when you're writing, and especially when you're writing as a poet, which is the thing you do, is like you have to have some conceptual awareness and stringing together linear thoughts to make it work, but that could be saved for the editor, not the creator, right? But also, in meditation, even if like you said, sometimes the past comes through, and that is also the present, and it's the old three times in Buddhism. But in meditation, that the whole thing is not about not having those conceptual thoughts. It's about noticing that they're there and
Right.
letting them go, which, poetry's, if that sort of thing happens when you're writing, some kind of like you'll come up with something that you didn't think of, you know, I don't know. You could probably come up with
Hmm.
something from one of your poems, like you think you're going to write about this, but then this image keeps coming up, so you write about that. That's sort of like the thought that keeps coming in as you meditate. It's like you look at it, you notice it, and you let it go, right?
Well, yes, absolutely. And one of my early meditation teachers told me that her meditation teacher, um, at the beginning of her practice, told her, well, actually, it's okay to sit with a notebook there because if you have recurring thoughts and they're kind of getting in the way of your really being
Right.
present, just jot them on the page. And so then the page can hold them instead of needing to kind of keep track of them in your mind.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, you can go look at the page and you can say, well, are these really A, so important? And B, are these things that I'm going to forget? Because you're sitting there like, oh, I have to catch that thought. I'm going to forget it. And you're like, actually, I'm not going to forget that it's X, Y, or Z. I've had that thought 1,000 times before, or whatever it is.
Yeah, right.
So, but I think that the page can actually be a place to let the thoughts go because the page can hold them, instead of the mind, instead of the body. It can
Yeah.
kind of be a container.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like I've done that before, and then I get in sort of like a bad habit of like jotting down whatever it is, and it shouldn't. And then I don't want to do that, and then I sort of
Right.
like scold myself for doing that because I don't need to jot that thought down. But I certainly get it if it's like, this could be a poem because this image is awesome, and you don't want to forget it, right?
Well, I actually don't write anything down when I meditate now. I used it more as an early practice to
That's
help me
good.
meditate,
Yeah.
just because I would look at the page and be like, actually, nothing I jotted down is that important.
Yeah.
And so I don't do it anymore. And I try not to use, I do meditate before I write. And I find it really, and I do this with students all the time. And I have recordings if anyone's interested in trying this, free recordings on my website. Maybe we can have a link to them. But if you meditate before you write and then you write, and I
Right.
often read a poem and give a prompt, that's really productive. I try, if a great idea comes to me when I'm meditating, to trust that if it's meant to be there, it will be there on the other side. And
Right.
if it's not, it won't be. So I really now, because I have a more established meditation practice, don't usually have that pen and paper, but it was a good beginning
Yeah, that's kind of why I
practice.
talked about it, is because that's
Yeah.
true. I don't jot anything down when I meditate, but what I did find is that and maybe it was from earlier doing that, is that it is always there if there's a good afterwards, because meditation makes you so focused. That's the whole point, right? It's like we're
Exactly.
in our regular walking around life, unless we are really good at bringing our meditation practice to the everyday, which is the whole point, is that we're not quite as focused as we are when we've meditated. So it's that focus that helps you like keep that idea somewhere where you can go shuffle around and get it later, right? So yeah, and you did write a beautiful postscript in your book, I Say the Sky, that
Thank you.
that hints at that Buddhist insight. I'm so glad you put that postscript in there. It was kind of a cool thing. I've never seen a postscript in a poetry book before, but I really like it. In it, you expressed something I talk about all the time in my podcast with my sangha and my with my course students and my book, is that the dynamic aspect of acceptance, because acceptance is usually considered, oh well, what can I do? It's a resignation rather than dynamic acceptance. My teachers always said acceptance is transcendence. And that's the way they'd say it. Acceptance is transcendence.
Mm,
Because if you dynamically accept whatever it is, even the worst possible things, you have taken a huge step, if not a complete step, to transcending the thing that needs your acceptance. So I'm going to read that part of your postscript, if you don't mind.
Sure, yeah, thanks.
In encountering myself and coming to accept myself as I am, I also need to encounter my past, which included violence and a violation that I did not for a long time want to admit. And in coming to accept myself as I am, I needed to accept the world as it is. We find ourselves in a world of trance. We are surrounded by senseless destruction, injustice, inequity. To accept is not to condone or to become passive. Rather, to see the truth is to wake up. Now, that was beautifully said in what I was just trying to say. And you said it as a poet would. Would you like to talk more about our struggle with accepting things as they are, especially from your perspective as both the sort of a mindfulness meditation teacher, yoga teacher, writing teacher, writer? Um, you would have some insight in how people deal with that. Can you
Hmm.
say more about this?
Yeah, I think one of the things I always have loved about literature is a place where people can put truths that are sometimes uncomfortable, but that aren't talked about all the time. And that kind of like secret inner lives that people are living that isn't really communicated so much in just kind of chit chat. And at the same time, so I was always drawn to that, but I did spend personally a fair amount of energy, I think, in my life not looking at things, some things that were really too difficult to look at. And I have compassion for that and understanding. We can only look at certain things when we're ready to look at them, and that makes sense. And that's helpful that our psyche is structured like that. But I do think that our process of growing is to have more and more capacity to see what's really there, within us and around us, and that Buddhist practice helps us to sit with what is. And my teachers are primarily Thich Nhat Hanh, but also I practice Vipassana in the tradition of Goenka, and there's just a lot of sitting
Right.
with what is, um, because we waste so much energy pretending that reality is something other. Um, and we see this on a global scale or on a national
Oh
scale, right?
yeah.
Like, is climate change real, for example? Well, we can say it's not, that it's a hoax, but that doesn't make it go away,
No.
right? So, what narrative we choose to live in is really important for the actions that we take. And if we're not kind of coming from a reality based um, awareness and narrative, then our actions aren't going to be reality based. And I think that our practices, our Buddhist practices, our writing, and our kind of social and political actions all can support one another to to be with what is,
Right.
to be compassionate towards it, and to take action based on what's actually happening.
Yeah, yeah, and no, it is so true, and we've seen it in like the past 10, 7 years, whatever it's been with so much with climate change and upheaval and direct effects so across to us in ways that we denied for the longest time because it wasn't happening to us, and then it was happening to us, and then we couldn't deny it, yet we're still denying, some people still deny it. And then social injustice, political upheaval, the pandemic to me was the major calling out of how people um had no skills in accepting like impermanence and
Mm,
change. It's like, it was like so all the different reactions to it, it's like some people, because they couldn't believe that a virus could do this, then they had to get mad at everything else but the virus. It's like what Shanti Deva, I don't know if you know of Shanti Deva, the way of the Bodhisattva, said, instead of getting angry at the person who's wielding the stick, we are to get angry at the anger in all of us. and
Hmm.
and it's and I saw it most with the pandemic because it reached such critical mass so quickly and took everybody by surprise. But there wasn't the least bit, but nothing was surprising about that happening, really. Is we just
Right.
never wanted to ever look at the fact that something like that could happen, or never wanted to believe that, oh my God, I am impermanent, my family is impermanent, my job is impermanent, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
quite a lesson. And so that is so true. And I still get even in my classes in my sangha, I still get people who fight about that concept of acceptance. If I accept it, then I'm not, it's sort of like I'm not doing what I need to do to make it not happen or whatever. I mean, we're not saying, be a doormat, lie down and die, or don't be political, or don't fight for social justice. It's just somehow inside of you, you have to keep accepting what is rather than wanting what isn't, because that's the second of the Four Noble Truths, right? It's that we're grasping at what isn't or what is.
Right. Right. And I think for me, it was helpful to realize that what we're accepting is the present moment.
Right.
We don't know what the next moment is.
Very
But
good.
when we say, I'm accepting this moment, that doesn't mean, therefore, I'm not going to act, or therefore, I'm not going to want something different for the next moment. But I cannot change what this moment is, or the past.
Right.
I can only try. I don't have power to change the whole world, but I have just power over my actions
Right.
to do what I can do to take a step in the direction that I want to go in from this place here.
That's right. And that was perfectly said, because it's like, the present moment is just that. It's the present moment. And then the next present moment is the next present moment. And so now keeps happening. And yet anytime you can make another choice, right? To do
Right.
something different. Um, Go ahead.
And I think that poetry is actually a real companion for me in this because I use that word companion. I think, when we're in those moments of grief or of loss or of worry or whatever it is, things that are uncomfortable. We have our meditation practice, but we also have poetry. We also have literature to turn to as a kind of solace. And I think of, so many pieces of literature that I love, starting from when I was young and I read Anne Frank.
Yeah.
There she was in a situation that she couldn't control, hiding away in her little attic apartment, but that agency in writing and that companionship in her diary. And that then, you know, all these years later in a different country, so I was able to read, so many people are able to read and find that place of connection. So from that place of feeling like frustrated, despair, angry, whatever it is
Yeah.
that we're feeling around the situation, literature can be that place of recognition, connection, companionship, and also making something beautiful of it. Um, so
Yeah.
it being whatever it is we find ourselves in.
That is absolutely true. I had I've had that same thing about that. It's like you recognize in this other, in the writing from this other who you don't know, right? And is like you said, is sort of could be from decades past in another part of the world. You There's a kinship, and then there's a sense of understanding, which right away makes you feel better, right? And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
and then especially in some, like the example you gave with Anne Frank. Well, she could do that. What can't I do, right? um you said about that, it's that that's kind of a therapy, right? It's been said that writing is a form of therapy, and I certainly have experienced that, as I know you have. You will agree, probably both in
Right.
your work
Yeah.
and your teaching, but your work is obvious because you even talk
Hmm.
about it right out. Can you say more though, but from your experience as a teacher of people who you teach, because you're teaching it as sort of a therapy, I think, from the way you described it on your website. Um, how your students may have found writing to be therapeutic, and did it come as a
Yeah.
surprise to them?
Well, I guess I want to, if it's okay, just talk about, for me, I really believe that therapy and craft support one another.
Uh-huh.
And so when I write, it's therapeutic and it's craft.
Right.
And so the very act of creating something that has a
Ah,
structure and that has, I'm making choices about what word sounds good next to this word, and it's in dialogue with other poems that I've read. It becomes, for me, a richer form of and more embodied form of healing,
yeah.
because it's not just, I love journaling. I think that's so helpful, but it takes it beyond journaling to like the whole stages of working through it, seeing it, revising it. For me, it's not just the editorial mind that's revising, kind of like analytical, but really, again, about relationship, about building
Yeah.
something that has meaning, that has beauty, and then that can be shared with someone else. So it's a full kind of
Oh, wow.
cycle of process.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And I'll interrupt before you answer the other part
mhm.
if you had something to answer, but that's excellent because I hadn't thought of it that way when I first posed this question, because it is
Yeah.
you know, sometimes I think like editing is such a freaking drag, but it's like when like my partner always says, I don't know how you write. Writing is so impossible. I like edit like for an hour on a little email sometimes. Did I say the right thing? Should this word be here? And it's like, but yet when I always go into editing thinking it's a drag, but then when I'm trying to craft it, like you said, it's like a craft is therapeutic. It's like sculpting some clay or whatever. It's like, now does this word work? Does this have the emotion I want, or how is this going to strike somebody? And it's like you get so involved, it really does put you into flow. Which
Yeah.
I almost hesitate to acknowledge based on my hatred of editing, but
You don't really hate editing.
yeah, I
Admit
think I
it.
do when I sit
Right.
down to do it. People talk about the blank page anxiety. I think I have less blank page anxiety than I do editing anxiety
Hmm.
because it just seems hard or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I think writing is often for many people very anxiety producing. And I think we have a history of that in our culture, that the first thing that most of us learn in school when we're in kindergarten or first grade, that we're saying, okay, it's no more playing. Now we have to do work,
Yeah.
is you sit at a desk and you sit still and you write, and you have to do it in the correct way, and you maybe get graded even. And so there's very, very early on this idea that it's work
Yeah.
and there's a right and a wrong, and play is something different. And so when I'm teaching, I really try to get people back into a more embodied sense of writing,
Wonderful.
where we're not just sitting down and cutting off the mind from the body, but we're listening to the whole body. What is it that the body wants to say? And most of us are relatively comfortable speaking. It's a medium that we use all the time. It's like, I can't play a violin. If I were a violin teacher, that would be different from being a writing teacher, because we use our language all the time.
Right.
Um, so, how do we get our writing, our creative practice, closer to the more embodied speech? What is it that I really want to say? Not what am I supposed to say,
Yeah.
which is like what we do in school. Now, it's helpful to have that training, because if we didn't have any training, we wouldn't know how to write our letters at all. But to make the and so similarly, I always tell my students, read. If you're a writer, read, learn from books, get that other language into your body. Read as a writer, but don't think about it analytically, like what's the right way to do this, what's the wrong way to do this, but to get into that more flow state, that more intuitive state where we can. And that's why meditating, and sometimes I do yoga also and guide students to do yoga before writing, that we can tap into a deeper level of intuition and awareness and non-conceptual presence.
Yeah,
So
I love
yeah,
that you say you make it a more of a somatic process rather than a conceptual process, because it is so true when you're it's funny because writing doesn't seem like that to people, and when I'm thinking back of what I just told you about editing, it doesn't seem like that. It seems like this such a deeply discursive and conceptual, well, take this out, I'll put this in here, I'll take but when you hit the right thing, you feel it. And when you say what you want to say rather than what you think you should say, is it's like a jackpot, and you can feel it immediately as soon as it comes out of you. It's like, and you're right, it's because our first mode of communication, and we're used to expressing ourselves directly in speech, but not in writing. We think, like you said, have to be um more correct, right? than
yeah.
just saying what I want to say. It's like I have a poet friend who said, who he's a published poet, and I'm a hack poet, but we talk about poetry all the time. And he always talks about Charles Bukowski, and I
Hmm.
always say, what, do you have to be crazy to be a good poet? Because it's like that, it's like, if no one knows about, I don't know how to describe him. Maybe you can better than I can, but he just,
Yeah,
it's just out there, whatever.
yeah. And that kind of messiness of mind, I think of him as a little bit like big, but also a little messy,
Yeah,
um, and flamboyant. So it's interesting to think about mindful speech, which we learn in a Buddhist practice,
right.
and to think about what kind of poetry do we want to put out there. And sometimes I like
I
Bukowski,
don't
and I've liked,
I've stumbled over it too.
and sometimes I teach his work, but I think of it as an example of, there are different styles, and so what am I trying to say? We can be conscious about what aesthetic we're writing with. And so
Yeah,
as we become more conscious of our language, we are more mindful in our speech, which is one of the precepts of like a
right.
Buddhist practice. But similarly, as we become more mindful in our writing, it can be an amazing um, place of insight and recognition that we can say, oh, yes, I can just say this, but as I write it, I get to go even more deeply. Do I really think that? And I often think that when we write, we get to interact with ourselves, our own knowing, our own understanding on a deeper level than through speech. And one of the things that's really healing about writing is exactly that process of going from having all these experiences that we don't necessarily have language for, we just living, and translating them into language, and doing that process of reading them back to ourselves.
Right.
Is that exactly right? And doing that revision process, that mindful revision process. And then it's really a way to come to know ourselves, to come to know the world around us, to come to know the relationship between self and world on a much deeper level. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's like, that this I forgot who said it. I write to find out what I'm thinking about. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
I was a writing center coordinator for the college, and that was the thing we had up on our little room where we worked with the students, and it's so true. And I think, not even just journaling, like you said, if you have to go through the revision process and read it back and say, does that sound like what I'm really, what I'm really trying to say, and does that feel right in my gut, and all of that stuff is it really sort of enforces you to get to know yourself, because like we've talked about, is like, well, there's a lot of things we kind of skim the surface of in ourselves, not wanting to go there or whatever. And then if something bursts out and say, do I really want to say that? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Then, and if I do, how do I want to say that is really a great way to get familiar to what it is. Not, and I think thinking about in this way of we're talking about is actually an incorrect way to say it. I'm right to find out what I'm feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right.
so
All of those things. Yeah.
yeah, reading poetry though. Let's talk about reading poetry a bit.
Yeah.
It's healing too, right?
Yeah.
By
Absolutely.
introducing us, like I said before, to kindred spirits and maybe helping us find oh, some meaning in an otherwise confusing fog of emotions. Like sometimes I can feel something I wasn't sure I could identify when someone else says it, the way they
Yeah.
say it. Maybe I'm just sort of like flirting with feeling it, and then someone says it. And I think your three-part poem, Anxiety, for instance, this poem drops me into your anxiety, but also triggers my own tendency towards mania and anxiety. I have a little of that mania going on. And I have to say, part two of that three-part poem especially made me a little crazy reading it. and and so much, and I kept thinking, oh, I bet you somebody with ADHD or obsessive compulsive disorder or something reading this would just go berserk. But it crazy in an identifiable way, and this is what I'm talking about. The reading poetry is therapy, and that's the thing about it, and about writing. The writing puts something in the reader, right?
Right.
And it bypasses the thinking mind, the linear thinky process, and goes right for the gut, right? Right immediately for the gut. And so it's way more somatic than cognitive, as you were talking about before. So I recognize it's therapeutic for you to write about your anxiety, but when you do write about it, do you ever think about how readers would respond? Like, do you think that it would make me crazy?
Well, I'm kind of honored that it made you crazy because there's only one poem there. I think that no, I do think about that. I think about that a lot, actually. I think a lot about how a lot of contemporary literature focuses on difficult situations and doesn't kind of offer a path out. And I wanted to put a range of experiences in my book, but this poem, Anxiety, comes towards the beginning, and I think that sets the scene for. I talk about difficult things in the book, and difficult emotions and different like experiences have happened to me and in the world. So to talk about difficult things and not to have some emotional response to them doesn't feel wrong. I mean, doesn't feel
Right,
right. Like
yeah.
we want some emotional response, but I also hope in the book to both have that acceptance. Here are these difficult experiences, but also here's a path out, right? Just the way Buddhism can be a path out of suffering. My hope is that these poems overall end up leaving people feeling more at peace and more hopeful, but not by denying or not including things that are difficult,
Right.
but by actually working through things that are difficult,
Well, it's like
which we all have.
right.
And it's a cycle.
Thich Nhat Hanh, like he says, the way out is in. It's like the only
Right.
way you're going to get out of whatever the stuff is, whether it's eh, emotional stuff, inability to deal with what's happening in the world. You have to take it inside, and that's what meditation is about. But poetry does the same thing. It's like I have been on a particularly okay path recently where I haven't had like anxiety moments. And then and then I read that and I had it again, but that was good because I thought to myself, well, it's all still there, and if I can be triggered that easily by a poem, then there are other things I should be looking at here.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so it's a little like mirror when we're reading.
Right.
Oh, here's an offering. Um, so yes, I am aware of the relationship between the poem, my own experiences translated onto the page in the poem, and then how the page then will translate into the reader's body is my hope, and take the reader on a journey. But again, as I said, I wanted to have this experience, but I didn't want the whole book. I feel like if the whole book were just anxiety poems, that would be I wouldn't feel like I was wanting to gift that to people. That wouldn't be.
No, exactly. If that was the case, I'd say, don't anyone ever get this book.
But do you want me to read just this one section and then we can read a non-anxiety poem as
Well,
well?
actually, you got to the place where I said there's a little weirdness about talking poetry for a full podcast episode, and so if we talked about you reading some, and I wasn't sure if you would read part two of anxiety because but I really wanted to hear you read it because of the way it felt to me. So if you want to start there, and then we'll go to a couple
Okay.
other.
So listeners, it's not too long. You'll be okay.
Yeah,
You'll get
you can get through it. Trust me.
through. Okay, part two. Eat and clean, money and right, in the clothes box of the 3 hours and a half while the children are attended, let me grant for the space that nothing is missing. Let the box close on meaning, everything meaning itself yet symmetric. That to eat is to clean, as is money to write, or that, if the voice says differently, to write is to write, as to clean is to clean, as is money to eat. See how perfectly? And when I sit down to write, and I am still here, look at the page that is clean, and that means when I write, nothing that is missing.
It's amazing, that one. I
And
sort of want to
that's
know
the like.
where you were, if I can ask that, or is it too personal?
Sure. I actually wrote this poem a really long time ago, to tell you the truth. Um, and this is the kind of like anxiety. This is the angsty writer, right?
Yeah.
There's the writing for therapy, and there's like writing as part of the anxiety, right? Like, how is this all? So I put the poems together in I Say the Sky. I had a manuscript, and I was pretty happy with it. Um, and then I did one more pass, and I think there's the writing of the poems, and then there's the revising of the poems, and then there's the putting together of a collection. And all of those processes are both therapeutic and craft, like creating
Right.
order and structure out of, our lives and sharing it with others. So really thinking about how do I want to share this with others? And when I had this manuscript that was almost done, I had the thought, I have these older poems that didn't get in my first book. What would it be like to put some of those older poems in this manuscript that's newer?
Mhm.
And so Anxiety is one of those older poems that I wrote many years ago that came into this manuscript towards the end
Mhm.
when I did a kind of last round of revisions.
Mhm.
Um, and I like that. It kind of gave the book a bigger breadth of
Yeah.
range
Yeah.
to have. So I wrote this when I had little kids. My kids are now both um, much older in college, and um, so I had, and when I was really starting to be serious about my writing career, and just full of lots of questions and anxiety about how do I fit everything in, and who am I, and how am I going to make this
Oh,
work,
well,
and
like
oh my
the
goodness,
money and
yeah,
the eating and the writing. It was just like I
yeah,
actually
just.
felt all that. I actually felt, whoa, yeah, I know
And
that.
it's, yeah, exactly. The eating, the anxiety as a young woman around eating, I feel like I've moved beyond a lot of these things, but they're personal, but they're also cultural, right? Our anxieties around these things.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, people eat when they're anxious. Most people, unless they get cured of that or something. But it was just the way you circled around those things. I didn't even some of them I couldn't identify with, but from my own personal life, but boy, so many of them I could. And just the thing, the way you structured the poem, the way the mind works, where it comes coming back, even though you thought, okay, I got rid of the money and the eat. No, there it is back again. Oh, you know, I
Yeah.
love that. So we'll go on to something a little less angsty producing. So I would love to hear you read something that's entirely different called Teach Me. It's such a beautiful ode to the planet. It's a mix of praise, celebration, and angst. I felt
Mhm.
the angst, but I also felt that transcendent acceptance or isness, if you will, that we talked about before when you talked about the concrete parking lot and the wires crossing the open expanse. So I won't give too much of it away, but I just want to tell you what resonated with me when I read that.
Thank you so much. Yeah. This is very much a poem for me about acceptance. Um, and then what comes that transcendent acceptance. I love that. Teach me how to pray anywhere. Teach me that you live not only in the open field, the cardinals singing at first dawn, but also in the concrete parking lot of the Everett Mall, in the flashing lights of Old Navy, in the wires crossing the open expanse above me. The cars speed down the highway. Their tires spin, spin. There is so much work to do. Dark oil flows over the whole land. Teach me how to praise your whole body.
Yeah, that was those last two lines, it was sort of like a turning, it was the dark oil and then the back to the prayer. It was yeah, that went to the feels.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think for me also, what's the relationship between the body of the earth and our human bodies, our female bodies,
Hmm.
my female body. Um, what's the relationship between what's happening collectively and individually, and how do we feel it? I
Right.
am always so honored when people say that the poems affect them on a kind of emotional level, that you feel it, because that's my hope, that it's not just like an idea, but that we feel through
Right.
through poetry.
Yeah, I can read poetry and appreciate poetry that gets me conceptually. Like I think, well, that's well done, right? But it doesn't mean as much as if it doesn't like make me anxious or get me in the feels, you know.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean as much. I mean, it's like when you start, teach me to pray, and then the cardinal song at dawn is just so beautiful, and then it gets all that other stuff that we want to label as not so beautiful, but then there is that sort of you're dancing with acceptance there, and that comes across, I think, beautifully.
Thank you.
So, and then the last one that I picked, and then I'll allow you to read what you would like to read if you would.
Sure.
Maybe I think we have time for one or two more after this one because this next one that I asked for is not that long, I don't think. And that is March. There is so much that grabs me in this poem. Sort of the way that March grabs me, and shakes me out of winter sleep, right? Although I don't know where you live, but buds don't come up in March in Rochester. So, but we do have the sloppy, melty snow part. But so anyway, the question that you put in the middle of that poem that stopped me dead is what in you needs melting. Brilliant. I couldn't even read on for a while. I had to linger over that question and deal with that question. So if you could, Nadia, March.
Thank you. March. All winter we walked on the fallen sky, walked on clouds until we fell thigh deep to earth. Now the clouds are running down the side of the mountain in small hidden rivers. What in you needs melting? What do you do with your anger and your hope? All night down the side of the mountain, waters run together where we cannot see. Underneath, the earth is awakening. Once more, the tips of bare branches put out new buds. Again, they clasp their small palms together in prayer.
Yeah, just beautiful.
And that poem was inspired by Thich Nhat Hanh. I mean, I think you asked me how does Buddhism show up in my poetry,
Right,
and I don't think I answered that question. I would say in almost every way, just because I feel like Buddhism, Buddhist practice,
right.
Buddhist teachers, Buddhist meditation, but also precepts and philosophy shifted my nervous system, and it shifted the way I think about the world. And Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings, in particular on interbeing, shift the way I see everything. And so this to me is also a poem about interbeing. Ty talks about drinking the clouds
Yeah, he
in
does.
your cup of tea.
Right.
And so, thinking about, oh, we're walking on the fallen sky
I
because we're walking on the
wondered.
snow. Yeah, we're walking on the snow. So we're really sorry. That's my singing bowl. We're walking on the sky when we're walking on
Yeah,
the
I
snow.
wondered where you pulled that image from, but yeah, it is a Thich Nhat Hanh because he has the clouds in the paper and the clouds in your tea, and it's like
Exactly. Yeah.
it is. But I just love that image of the clouds walking on the clouds all winter, and you're falling into the clouds up to your thighs, and it's like, well, if you don't live in a place with deep snow, you wouldn't have a clue, but it's beautiful, just beautiful. So,
Thank you so much.
are there a poem or two you would like to read? Since I do think we have a few
Um,
minutes.
well, since I just read March, maybe I could read August.
Perfect.
Since we're talking in the summer. So, um, this poem comes at the end of my book, and by this time you know that I have children. Um, but the poem is coming out. It was actually recently published in the magazine The Sun, which is a magazine I really admire. So I was honored to be published there. And we changed the title to August at 43, which maybe makes it a little bit easier to
Yeah.
understand what's happening in the poem. It's about having a little miscarriage, not a super traumatic one, um, as some I know are. But the whole book is about cycles, and there are different times of day. We go through the cycles of the day, we go through the cycles of the
Yeah.
year, and then we go through kind of different birth dates. And so I kind of get older, and there's that kind of, yeah, cyclical nature
Hmm.
in the book. So anyway, this comes at the end, and I think those are just some of the things that it would be helpful for a reader hearing the poem for the first time to know. August. For 6 years we took no precaution, and my body made no baby. Nor did we plot to create another life, content to let nature do what it would, which was this morning bring bright red blood in the toilet, so bright and sudden in its burst it seemed almost alive, and then a little plop. Child, we will never have, end of something. In the course I'm taking, we are taught happiness is found in the deep I, in the consciousness of consciousness. But I resist. I want blood and bone, our son in my arms, our daughter's laugh, her wonder and unapologetic tears. I want relationship, the grass that grows no place but the earth, the stubbly green beneath our bare feet when we ran on the lawn, the rich smell of dirt, the pebbles, the grit, those summers when we were all so much younger and didn't know. Such gifts. As now, our children almost grown, we hardly know this is as close to heaven as we can come. So close to so many changes, the ice, even now, melting at the poles. And see, these tiny red tomatoes at the ends of the plants, little globes of sun, offerings we pick and eat whole.
Wow, that takes you everywhere, that one. Yeah, it does. It takes you everywhere. I mean, it takes you to August and the feeling, of what you went through and your life. I mean, it is kind of full circle, full cycle here. It definitely
Hmm.
is. When you read the book, I did notice how those were sort of that you were moving through your life in these poems. It was
Hmm.
clear but yeah, that is a that's a journey, that one. It's a definite
Yeah.
journey.
Hmm.
So, was there another one you wanted to read, or I mean, I don't want
Sure.
to
Why don't,
force you, but
yeah,
again, it's like we're talking
I'm
about
happy to read.
poetry, so we should be reading it, right?
What about if I read the last poem of the book?
Let me see. Yeah, I think I know what you're. Oh,
Let's
yes, you. Yes,
see.
yes. Please do.
You. And it's an invitation. So someone asked me, is this poem also written to yourself? Are you the you? And yes, I am the you in this poem, but also you readers, you listeners are also the you. And it's an invitation. I hope that the poem is an invitation to listeners to listen to their own voice, to listen to that call for your own creative voice, your own creative practice.
Yeah, great.
You, you who were so quiet. Didn't you know there was a symphony inside you? Didn't you know you were composing? The trumpets are so glad, and the French horn, in its great deep beckoning, resounds. Didn't you hear the calling from your stillness, as if you had looked out over calm waters to see the geese rise up in unison in front of the setting sun? Such a squall of color, and your whole being given to the one who rests in the great upflapping, the geese mounting higher and higher into the evening, growing brighter and louder still.
That's a perfect one to end with because it's, I think, an invitation for all the yous out there to uh to make their French horn sound louder and I played French horn in high school orchestra, so
Oh,
I always
I love that. That's
I
perfect.
always love any reference to the French horn because to me there's no other sound like that when it kind of rises up like a geese, a goose call.
Yeah.
I'm sure you meant that, right? I didn't just
A
that was true.
deep knowing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's true. Um, Nadia, that this has just been just a joy for me. I hope it's going to be for other people. There's so much more I would love to talk to you about, but I don't want to take up any more of your time. I will, of course, post links, as I told you, to where our listeners can learn more about you, about your writing, about your Align Your Story writing school and all that it offers. But before we close, is there anything else you would like to talk about that I didn't bring up or touch on?
This is great. Thank you so much. It was really, really a lovely conversation. Thank you for your careful reading and wonderful questions and comments and insights, as always. But I also wanted to say to any listeners, if you're interested, I have, as I think I mentioned earlier, um, a 5 day meditation and writing little challenge where each day I send you a 15-minute recording, which has a short meditation and then a poem and a prompt and then time to write. So the whole practice only takes 15 minutes. And if you don't want to do the 5 day, I also have just some recordings that you can download on my website. But I encourage you, I can talk about what happens when we bring meditation and writing together, but it's just so much more exciting to see for yourself, to make it experiential. So they're completely free. You can go to my website and download them, or we can put links in the bottom and try it for yourself because it's a really new synergy happens when you consciously bring that meditation and the writing practices together.
Yeah, excellent. I
And I'd
think
love to
that
share that.
it's a great idea. And I am going to put a link to your website, but I might put a specific link to that area so
That
that
would be
and
great.
call
Yeah.
it out so they will know because I think it's wonderful. To me, any way you can offer someone different ways to meditate is excellent. It's like right now I'm working with my Sangha with all the different kinds of meditations, because there are so many and it is highly personal, even though people think it's only the one way, it's only shamatha, it's only vipassana, it's only this, but there's, analytical meditation, visualization, all sorts of ways to meditate, and that is one of them. So thank you
Yeah.
for of that offering. Again, wonderful to talk to you, Nadia. Thank you for being here. I know what you shared today will inspire listeners to read more poetry, try to
Hmm.
write some of their own, or just try to write. That would be wonderful. And so thanks again, Nadia.
Thank you. Thank you. What a pleasure.
That's it for this episode. You can find Nadia, more about Nadia, at nadiacolburn.com. That's NADIACOLBURN.com, where she offers meditations and free resources for writers. Of course, you'll find links to this website, her offerings, and books in the show notes. Next up, my usual reminders. We are currently completing our study of The Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva and the companion book Becoming Bodhisattvas, a guidebook for compassionate action by Pema Chodron in the Everyday Sangha. The Sangha is a private, donation-supported group that meets virtually via Zoom every other week on Saturday mornings at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. Our meetings consist of a service first, including traditional vow recitations, chanting, and a short meditation period. The service introduces a more ritual and liturgy that you would find at a non-virtual Buddhist temple, church, or sangha. It also includes a Dharma talk by one of the practice leaders or myself, and possibly a Dharma glimpse by one of our sangha members. After the service, we open it up to discussion of our current book study or anything that was inspired by one of the Dharma talks or just by your life. Consider joining the Sangha to be a part of a warm and welcoming Sangha community. You can learn more about the Sangha by viewing the latest bonus YouTube podcast where me, Bradley Janayo Sensei, and Terry Zenkai Hoskin, who are our practice leaders, talk about what the Sangha is all about and what everyday Buddhism is all about. You can also support this podcast and the other activities of Everyday Buddhism by becoming a community member. If you do, you'll have access to all members-only podcasts, the Introduction to Buddhism Course 1.0, and the new Introduction to Buddhism Course 1.5, a meditation discussion board, and an education series on a private group that is not on a Facebook platform. And speaking of the Introduction to Buddhism Course 1.0, it is a live virtual class via Zoom, and it starts very soon. The next class will start on Thursday, August 29th, 2024. These virtual Zoom meetings will start at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, U.S. Eastern Time. Now, that's Thursday, August 29th, 2024, which is only 9 days from now. So register now to get the first readings and reflections in your email before the class. The link to register is in the show notes. If you don't follow me or Everyday Buddhism on any social media platforms we post in, you can go to the Everyday Buddhism website and join the membership community or the Everyday Sangha. Go to www.everyday-buddhism.com and click on either the tab that says Join Members Community or Join Everyday Sangha. Or you can join through Patreon at patreon.com/everyday Buddhism. Links to joining the Everyday Sangha and membership community and registering for the Introduction to Buddhism Course 1.0 are posted in the show notes. I thank all of you who contribute. This podcast, the community, and the Sangha all depend on your donations to continue to exist. I do not seek podcast sponsorships and do not ask for financial commitments or subscriptions for paid podcast members. So my work and the cost needed to support what I do is entirely self-funded, except for your donations. Please consider a one-time or continuing donation through Patreon or on my website's Donate tab. Or just buy me a coffee on the coffee cup link on the website. You can find all these links in the show notes. And thanks, too, to all of you who write in with comments and questions. I read all of your emails and may even pick your question to feature in a bonus podcast. Another way you can help is to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. It's important to share the podcast with others if you find it helpful in your life. And if you could, take a minute to comment so people will know why you love everyday Buddhism. That's it for the announcements for this time. So until next time, keep finding ways to make yours and everyone's days better.